Welcome, Peter and David.
G'day, Jacqueline.
Hi, Jackie.
Peter, let's dive straight in and talk about the Defence Review that the federal government released earlier this week. People's eyes might glaze over a little bit when they read about military infrastructure, tanks, missiles, and something called the Defence Strategic Review. So let me ask you straight to break it down for us. Why is this review so important?
There's an old saying, the definition of diplomacy, Jacqueline, is saying, nice doggy, while you reach around for a big rock. This government has been saying nice doggy to Chinese friends, trying to, in the words of the government, stabilise the relationship with China, while at the same time desperately trying to figure out what it needs to do to defend Australia's interests in the physical realm in the event that push should come to shove, which is a growing expectation across the entire world, actually, that push will one day come to shove one way or another. So this constitutes Labor's effort to find the big rock. And what have they come up with? Well, there's a lot in it, but there's nothing here to really glaze your eyes over when you look at the big conclusions they deliver. They've told us the three dominant problems. Number one, well, the first one they list isn't China. The first one they list is the US. And that is, it clearly states that the US is no longer the unipolar power dominating the Indo-Pacific. So America's weaker, relatively. Two, China is running up the biggest, it describes it as the biggest and most ambitious military build-up since World War II, without strategic rationale being provided to anybody about why they're doing it. So there's the threat. So America weaker, relatively, China much stronger, relatively. And three is the Australia part of the problem, and that is that the Australian Defence Force, in the words of this review, is not fully fit for purpose. So we are spending, Jacqueline, $48 billion a year of taxpayer funds on something that the government's own expert reviewers have just told us is not fit for purpose. This is a big and bracing thing for a government to put in an official public document.
Right. David, I want to ask you about that. It is a really stark warning. Basically, the threat is increasing exponentially. Meanwhile, we don't have an ADF that is equipped for a modern age of warfare. Can you tell us about some of the problems that the review says we're facing in terms of the actual military and why we're not up to the challenge of asserting enough force to keep off China as we stand?
I think one of the big messages out of the document is about missile defence. And what we've been seeing in Ukraine is the importance of missile technology to every nation's security. It's a war fought by long-distance artillery, rockets, not old-fashioned artillery, and fought with missiles. And one of the glaring sort of facts that's been observed by the government out of this review is that we don't have a capability to project force very far. So they're talking about improving and bolstering that missile strike capability from Australia, basically to the north. There's no other way of really looking at it, and projecting that force further if needed. Now, the document itself highlights that this is something that we don't have that we need, but I don't think we needed this document to tell us that, because the previous government did a defence update 2 years ago that also highlighted the need for stronger missile capability and stronger domestic munitions manufacturing. This document does the same, and we know that late last year the government arranged with two major defence suppliers, Raytheon and Lockheed Martin, to start working on stronger missile capability for Australia.
Yeah.
So that's one example where I think it's actually quite tangible in terms of what this defence review is about, and also it puts it in context. And I see the context as being a continuum. This is not a revolutionary new document that has suddenly told us that missile capability is a weakness. It's developing on from previous reports and actually previous decisions that this government's already taken to act on that.
I mean, in layperson's terms, one of the main things that I took out of it was that a land force, an army, is less important than it used to be, and basically we need long-range missiles. We need to be able to strike people without ever leaving home, and we can't sit around and wait for the Chinese to invade us in order to to properly defend ourselves against them. Is that correct, Peter?
Absolutely. I mean, Anthony Albanese made remarks in our papers last year about how, the strategic future of Australia wouldn't be decided in a land war in Queensland.
Yep.
The message has been coming for months now that they do not see the priority of things like armoured vehicles, tanks for the army, where some of the strategic pressures are quite different and need a different capability. It's an interesting sort of process they're going through at the moment, where this message is coming at a series of stages. We're yet to see all the things they're going to do to actually address that, but the rethink is real and it's important.
Yes, this point, Jacqueline, directly addresses Paul Keating's one of his biggest objections to current strategy that is emerging from Australia, but also from the US, Japan, South Korea, even the EU. But and that is, his point is that you don't need to have long-range strike capability. You only need to protect, because any Chinese aggression or aggression from anybody only counts if it is, in his words, crossing the beach. The Defence Strategic Review says that it's very unlikely that any country will try to cross the beach, but that Australia's security is vulnerable from other means by countries that don't even attempt to cross the beach. And foremost among them, and this review is explicit about it, is interdiction of our lifeblood, our lifelines in and out of the region. How do we get food and pharmacy, electronics, or they all come by ship? How do we make a living in the world? Well, we sell everything by ship. So what the Japanese did in World War II was to decide that Australia was too difficult, too big, and too far away to occupy. They were going to do the same thing, put bases in Papua New Guinea and the Solomons, and simply cut Australia off. And so this Defence Strategic Review is saying another enemy, a new enemy, which China is named as the threat, could simply do the same thing. So we need to be able to project force far enough, in a very infelicitous term that Defence Minister Richard Marles uses, impactful projection, which in English means
dreadful,
blowing up any enemy craft before it can either start interdicting your sea lines of communication or before they can lodge and set up a base on a Pacific island near us.
Yeah, so we've got to be able to project force over a much wider sphere of influence, if you like, and
because
over
the moment,
sea as well as land.
The horrible truth is Australia has no long-range strike capability. Nothing at the moment. As David said.
Just to butt in.
Yeah.
Sorry, Peter.
Yeah.
The data, the fact is from the government that our longest range weapon at the moment can reach 40 kilometres, and they want to scale up so that we've got missiles capable of reaching 500 kilometres. That's the scale of the weakness now compared to the capability they want to achieve.
That's true. That's land-based strike capability. We've got a couple of things that you can put on the Air Force that'll go further, but the essential problem is that it's ludicrously short range. China has missiles that can travel over 1,500 kilometres, and we have these dinky things that can go a couple of hundred. I mean, it's just not serious.
Peter, just quickly, we're talking very openly about China, and you talked before about the difference between the sort of diplomacy and the reality of the China threat. Does the review adequately acknowledge that China is the threat and pretty much the only threat? And can you tell us explicitly, what they said explicitly about China?
The review does not say that China is going to attack Australian interests. However, it clearly paints China as the source of disruption in the region. It says that China is engaging in the biggest and most ambitious military build-up since World War II, without giving the region the reassurance of why. So that's China is the only country explicitly named as a potential threat, but they've done it in that way. They haven't written the sentence, they haven't joined the dots to write the sentence that says China will one day try to attack our interests. But any intelligent reading of the document could lead to only that one conclusion, because it's the only named threat.
David, we know that military stuff doesn't come cheap, to put it mildly. On Wednesday, Defence Minister Richard Marles said that defence spending will rise over the next 10 years, and he didn't put an exact figure on it, but he said it would definitely be beyond 2% of the GDP, which is about where it is now. Peter, how does that compare to other countries? And even if we do up the defence spending in our budget, does it actually put us in a place where we can defend ourselves against China, given that China spends so much, so many billions per year on defence?
Well, so in Australia's history, the greatest share we've ever spent on defence spending was 40% of GDP during World War II.
Right.
It was survival stakes. In the 50s and 60s, it averaged about 3.5%. The Gillard government cut it to 1.4%. The Tories then said, well, we better build it up to 2%, which is now where it sits. This government says it's got to go over 2% of GDP. Compared to other countries, the US spends about 3.5%. China, on its own numbers, spends about 2%, although the numbers
But they're going up
opaque.
very steeply, aren't they?
It's been going up continuously for 28 years. China's defence spending today is 63% greater than it was 10 years ago.
And we should also say that the figures out of China are very opaque because they don't do a lot of transparent reporting of this stuff.
Precisely. They don't disclose what they're deploying. We only know what ships they've got in the water because of what intelligence analysts and private sector satellite watchers observe. So, it's highly opaque.
David, I just want to go to you quickly on that because this is going to cost a lot more money. It's for a risk for an existential threat, but something that probably is not uppermost in the minds of most Australian voters when they're thinking about, the various other pressures on their budget. How is the government going to introduce us to the idea that we have to spend a lot more of our money, of our public money, on this stuff?
Well, they're doing it very slowly and very cautiously because, first up, they announced this or released the Defence Strategic Review just before Anzac Day. There wasn't a lot of budget debate out of it. There was a lot of debate about capability. Since then, they haven't put a firm figure on where they want defence spending to get to as a percentage of GDP. We know it'll go above 2%. Anthony Albanese has talked about that in the past. Richard Marles has too, but there's no firm number. One of the big issues, of course, is AUKUS, and the nuclear submarine commitment involves $9 billion over the 4 forward estimates, that's the next 4 years, and $58 billion over a decade. That's actually less than various other government spending programs when you look at a decade-long scheme. But the important thing there is that they're reallocating money under this Defence Strategic Review and trying to save money on some systems in order to pour it into others. And that's why the armoured vehicles are not being purchased in the same volume. That's going to lead to savings of billions of dollars. At the moment, we can't point to a major defence cost that adds to the budget deficit over the next 4 years, that goes anywhere further from what we previously knew.
Yep.
So they're managing that carefully. And also there are clear signals about other potential savings. They are reviewing the surface fleet for the Navy. They've got a major commitment at the moment to buy a new class of frigates from BAE under a contract that's gone out to something like $45 billion.
Right.
So do we need as many surface ships as previously thought? There's a school of thought that says with the nuclear-powered submarines, we have a lower requirement for as many of those frigates. Is that an area, it's an open question, is that an area where they might find further savings in the future in order to reallocate to what they regard as a greater priority? Mm-hmm. So there is a movement of money within the budget that's happening while they're coy about the totality of the spending.
Okay, well, let's segue then to the budget, with the upcoming budget on May 9. So the government, as we're talking about increasing our military spend, it's also... The government also has a lot of competing pressures ahead of that budget. And I know that governments always have competing pressures in every budget, but this time it is a little bit different. This is the Albanese government's first proper budget. There are strong expectations it will do something for welfare recipients. We're in a cost of living crisis and we have various structural deficit issues. David, Cabinet is now considering the single parenting payment, specifically the cut-off age for that assistance, and we've heard a lot about that this week. At present, a single parent receives the payment until their youngest child turns 8, and Labor has some pretty tortured history on this payment, going back to Julia Gillard. Can you just talk us through that history very briefly?
Yeah, in 2012, the Gillard government cut income support for single parents, or overwhelmingly single mums, by stopping payments when the youngest child turned 8. That put those single mums onto New Start.
And
Labor has
at
agonised
a cut
about
at about $100 a week. Sorry to interrupt.
Yes, it cut them by about $100 a week because instead of getting the parenting payment, they got New Start, a lower payment. It cut their household income. Labor's agonised about it ever since. All the signs are that they will undo some of that, if not all. I don't think everybody's going to be cheering in the streets for the new policy because it won't totally reverse what they did in 2012. That's to be determined. We're yet to see the fine print of what they announce, but that's where they're heading. But I think they've been debating that a lot this week, and it's getting a fair bit of media attention, as is the call for a higher job seeker. But what we're not seeing at the moment is, I think, a really sharp message from the government about what they can't do and why they can't do it. They're reluctant to sort of get out there and say, job seeker can't increase, and here are the 4 reasons why. But I think that what's really galvanising the thoughts within ERC and within federal cabinet is the inflation challenge, which means they can't just pour money into the economy because then they'll be blamed later for keeping inflation higher and keeping interest rates higher.
Yep.
There's no way they want to be blamed for that. So they're very cautious about the volume of money that they put into the economy. And the other thing is that they're still conscious of the need to keep the deficit down and have some kind of pathway to a surplus. And I don't think that we'll see a surplus over the next 4 years, but we could see a chart that shows a glide path towards a better budget balance over a decade. We haven't seen a budget chart over a decade that shows a surplus for since before the pandemic. So they're wrestling with these issues, and I think there actually hasn't been enough attention on that big picture because that's what's driving some of the decisions on some of these policies one by one. And so despite the arguments about increased income support, I think they've got to be very selective. Let me put it this way. They will be very selective about what they put money into because they can't do everything. They're going to have to choose who are the most vulnerable and help them, knowing that they can't help everybody.
So what you're saying then is that it looks increasingly like they won't do anything they won't touch job seeker payments, even though the welfare lobby has been saying, the businesses have been saying, charities have been saying for years and years now that it is actually a barrier to employment because it's so low compared to other countries. But they're just going to, and their own government committee has found that that payment's seriously inadequate. That's the quote. So they're just going to ignore their own committee, do you think? Do you think they're going to ignore all the calls from those bodies?
I think they're going to have to say, we accept what you're saying, we hear you, we want to act on this, but we can't do that in this budget. Now, that's my reading of the current messaging that I'm seeing. That's the mail I'm getting.
Yep.
Right? And I know that's a very tough message to convey to people who are out there campaigning for a higher job seeker payment. However, all I'm trying to do here is say this is what the thinking is within the government about where they're going to go. I'm not denying the pressure on people looking for work, denying the financial pressure on households on low incomes. But the message very strongly from the government is that there's only so much that they can do in the current environment.
Our own Rachel Clune reported this week that, as you foreshadowed there, that the government looks like they will increase the age of cut-off for the single parenting payment from when your youngest child is 8, as it is now, to when the youngest child is 12. Various bodies, including the government's own Economic Equality Task Force, wants that late age to be lifted to 16, but they probably won't get that. Peter, I want to ask you a broader question about Anthony Albanese himself. He's expressed regret over Gillard's decision in 2012 to cut that payment for those overwhelmingly that cohort of overwhelmingly poor mothers. He's also made a lot of his own childhood about how he was raised by a single mother. She relied, I think, on disability payments and how challenging that was. Peter, talk to me about the optics of this for the Prime Minister, whether it's something that he absolutely has to do, absolutely wants to do, and what it might mean for him more personally.
I strongly suspect, and we'll know in a week and a half, but I strongly suspect that there will be some modest improvement in welfare payments. And it speaks to not only Albanese's personal story, his log cabin story, but also where he's positioning his government. he's trying to position it at the absolute centre and to occupy the centre in a wide way that blocks the sun from the coalition on one side and the Greens on the other. And if you look at what the coalition is saying and what the Greens are saying at the moment, it helps illuminate that point. And Albanese would be very happy about this. He would be happy to hear the coalition saying on almost everything, no, you're going too far. And the Greens saying on almost everything, you're not going far enough. That's kind of a set of beacons to guide Albanese to reassure him that he's going where he's intending to go.
This is just to wrap up the whole discussion. We've talked about military spending, which is huge. We talked about the welfare budget, which is also a huge percentage of government spending and locks in a sort of structural deficit that can increase over time. We're coming up to the budget. I want to ask you both. I mean, budget spending, they can be dry topics, but really they're about governments naming their priorities and asserting their values. And this is the first time that this government, a Labor government that we haven't had for sort of over a decade, will be able to do that. David, what do you think they'll be trying to assert in terms of their values in this upcoming budget?
Well, I think one area where we'll see some important change will be Medicare. It's an iconic Labor policy. It needs repair after 4 decades. Mark Butler, the health minister, says that it's in its worst state in 4 decades. So there's got to be more investment. And I think that's going to be really important in this budget to prove that a Labor government can repair Medicare. But I think another big theme will be skills in the workforce. Mm-hmm. They really do want to skill up the workforce. They know that there are skills shortages. They've got to have an answer on that because it's an economic issue as well as a fairness issue and an equity issue. Yep. I think that's the kind of theme that they've... We've seen some work on that theme by them, but I'm not saying I can predict what the major theme will be on Budget Day, but I think that's an area where we should have expectation to see some solid work.
Peter, what's the narrative that's going to that the Albanese government will want to spin out of this budget or want to craft from this budget?
Well, David's right that they'll want to make the point that they're a Labor government that cares but is also economically responsible. And if you look at the political fundamentals of the two major parties, there is a tremendous opportunity here for Labor. So, as everybody knows, for decades, the Liberals have had the brand perception that they were responsible with the finances, good with money, and that Labor was irresponsible. And this connects us with our first topic too here, Jacqueline, because the only other strong and consistent brand positive that the Liberals have had is that they're strong on national security. Well, going into the election last year, the May 2022 election where Morrison was running, both of those equities were right on the line. The Morrison government lost the national security equity because of the bungling around the Solomon Islands and talk of and the reality of a security pact signed with China. And on the economic responsibility side, it was largely neutralised, I think partly because the Liberals just spent so much money. And so the polling at that election and since shows that those two big brand equities of the Liberals are neutralised. Now, Labor has a position to drive that home. This is a once in, I was going to say a generation, but it's even more than that, once in multiple generations opportunity for Labor to claim those two from the Liberals. That would be just a tremendous fundamental change in the relative standing of the political parties. So this budget will be, and David made this point earlier, this budget will be a chance for them to demonstrate fiscal restraint and being more responsible than the Liberals have been in the past. At the same time, they're doing all this defence work and they're hoping that will illustrate that they're more trustworthy on national security, and certainly more active than the coalition was. So that's the opportunity that sits before Anthony Albanese, and that's what he's got in mind as he makes the big picture decisions.
To out-Liberal the Liberals on
Indeed.
Budget Day. Gentlemen, it has been an absolute pleasure, as always. I look forward to seeing... Well, actually, I won't see either of you in the budget lockup, but we might talk to each other on the phone. We'll be in different cities, but interconnected.
It'll still be a shared lockup. We'll be locked up together.
The shared trauma.
It'll still be a laugh a minute.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jacqueline.
Cheers.
See you, David.